Opening up the black boxes, Media Archaeology, an Archaeology, and Media Materiality. Abstract. This article examines the emergent field of media archaeology as offering a materialist approach to new media and specifically the Internet, constituting a traveling discipline, or indiscipline, rather than a new disciplinary paradigm. Following the lead of Siegfried Zielinski, 2006, it provides less an archaeology than an archaeology of media archaeology, understanding this term in political as well as methodological terms. To do so, it charts a trajectory through some of the sources of media archaeology, and its key theoretical articulations in the work of Zielinski and Friedrich Kippler up to its more recent articulations in the work of Jussi Parikka and Wolfgang Ernst. It uses this theoretical trajectory to illuminate some of the key problematics of media archaeology, in terms of both its practical application as a form of theoretical circuit breaking, Hertz and Parikka 2010, and its most imaginative speculations as not only a material but even a geological approach to media as evident in Parikka's most recent work, by way of such phenomena as the vernacular web, Lyalina, 2005, and the problematics of e-waste. Throughout it pays close attention to the value of media archaeology as a set of methods for new media research in relation to more established methodologies in media studies ranging from medium histories to cultural studies. In particular, it argues for articulating media archaeological approaches with media ecological ones, in order to bring out more clearly both the political stakes of the field and its potential contribution to studies of digital media. Media cross one another in time, which is no longer history. Kippler 1999, 115. Introduction, Situating Media Archaeology. This article aims to survey the emergent field and sets of methods of media archaeology with at least two key hypotheses. The first is that media archaeology can be better thought of, following Zielinski, in terms of archaeology, a rupture within contemporary media theories and histories, rather than a new discipline. Secondly, one of the key values of media archaeology is its insistence on the materiality and material ecologies of media objects, systems and processes, contrary to the still lingering tendency to view informational technologies and processes in disembodied and immaterial terms. This is distinct from phenomenological approaches centered on an assumed human body and sensorium, see Hansen, 2006. Instead, it consists of an attention to the material ecologies of human, non-human and magenic entities, the inorganic, organic and, as we shall see, geological strata that underlie technical media systems and networks, but which are frequently ignored in conventional media studies. Media archaeology is also distinct from Anglo-American approaches to digital media that tend to be empirical, social scientific epistemologies based on qualitative and quantitative research in which data sets are analyzed as traces of user practices such as linking or tagging, for example, or form the basis for digital mapping techniques such as social network analysis, SMA. While empiricism shares with media archaeology, and media materialism more generally, an interest in media objects, it constructs these objects epistemologically in terms of data and information, software and platforms, or in other words as objects of knowledge, bracketing off any non-informational aspects of their physicality. From a media archaeological perspective then, social scientific empiricism is not empirical enough, and needs to get closer to the materiality of objects such as chips, circuit boards and fiber optic cables, in the field of their material relations, rather than abstracting them as objects of knowledge about a human, non-magenic and insufficiently material digital society, see Parikka 2012a, 84-88. In this sense, the stakes of introducing a media archaeological approach to studies of new media are very high, in that its radical materialism at the very least problematizes dominant social scientific approaches to new media, while at the same time resonating with some research in the field. Nevertheless, this article will argue that this is provided that this will nevertheless require a modification of some media archaeological approaches as they were initially proposed. While, in theory, it would seem to have become easier to answer the question of what media archaeology is, given the recent appearance in English and other languages of many key media archaeological texts by authors such as Kippler and Zielinski, several edited collections and Parikka's recent volume simply entitled What is Media Archaeology, 2012a. In reality, each addition to this archive in many ways only increases its complexity. Parikka, for example, identifies four key themes and contexts flowing into media archaeology comprising of modernity, cinema, especially but not only new film histories, Foucauldian, histories of the present, and alternative or even alternate histories, but also says of this already complex situation that these themes are not exhaustive in any way, and the amount of work that is in spirit, even if not always explicitly in name, media archaeological is vast. Parikka 2012a, 14. If media archaeology is as Parikka and Hutamo propose elsewhere a traveling discipline, Parikka and Hutamo 2011, 3, or even indiscipline, then it can perhaps better be seen as a set of loosely related methods and principles, without any one single or stable essence. Given the major differences between key theorists and practitioners of media archaeology, not to mention the divergences from and even rejection of the use of the term itself by some of its key theorists, media archaeology is clearly a problematic and problematizing field, but herein lies its most important contributions to the field of media. And Perrick's edited collection on media archaeology, 2011, forcefully introduced this field of contemporary media research to a new Anglo-American readership. Part of this hidden nature is due to linguistic reasons, especially that many of the key thinkers in media archaeology were working in European, mainly German contexts, and even today not all of their key works are readily available in English. However, translation issues go well beyond the linguistic, since media archaeology is necessarily mobile rather than fixed. A reading of both contemporary media and media history against the grain, with multiple sources and diverse methods that nevertheless share a common rejection of dominant teleological accounts of media and technological history. The valuable introduction to Huetama and Perrick's volume Chartson, Archaeology of Media Archaeology, Huetama and Perrick 2011, 1-21, which in true media archaeological spirit means addressing work in multiple disciplines, eras and locations. Media archaeology is by no means limited to those works that explicitly invoke its name, and many of its precursors such as the work of Walter Benjamin and Michel Foucault, A.B. Warburg and Erwin Panofsky, Ernst Purchas and Marshall McLuhan have more usually been inscribed in a range of other disciplinary and transdisciplinary formations. Even many of the key theorists of media archaeology did not use the term to label their theoretical enterprise even, as it turns out, its two most prominent figures, Friedrich Kittler and Siegfried Zielinski. While the editors do an admirable job of tracing out the various historical conjunctions of the terms, media, and archaeology, the real origins of the field come from thinkers outside of media research, especially Walter Benjamin and Michel Foucault, as reread by media archaeologists who critically deploy their methods. This is in addition to the influence of media theorist Marshall McLuhan, whose seminal analyses of both the Gutenberg galaxy and electronic media have clear media archaeological implications. 2. In the case of Benjamin, it is especially his unfinished Arcades project, 2002, that provides an inspiration for media archaeology in its nonlinear engagement with the outmoded phantasmagoria of the 19th century, although several of his key critical essays are also amenable to a media archaeological reading. However, it is Foucault who provides something like a method for media archaeological research, even if his project for the archaeology of knowledge is taken up in varying and not in critical ways by media archaeologists from Kittler and Zielinski onwards. It is also important to note that these engagements with Foucault diverge considerably from his take-up in Anglo-American contexts as the theorist of modern discursive regimes of power. Nevertheless, such distinctions are difficult to maintain, since some branches of what the editors include as media archaeology draw not on German media theories but the new historicism into which Foucault's work was often assimilated in the English language context. This raises a key problem for the definition of media archaeology as a field. What is it that differentiates it from new historicism, the cultural history of technology, or science and technology studies, STS, approaches? This will underlie the following account of the Internet as a material technology, but provisionally it can be admitted that this distinction is far from clear in every project termed media archaeological. According to Ernst, another key media archaeologist whose work is only just beginning to appear in an international context, media archaeology adds to the study of culture in an apparently paradoxical way by directing attention, perception, analysis, to non-cultural elements of the technological regime. Ernst in Huetama and Perrick 2011, 244. The methodical attention given to forms of non-human magnetic inscription are, for Ernst, crucial to the media archaeological project, following the maxim that the media archaeological gaze is immanent to the machine. 2011, 251. Ernst refers in his chapter to a range of largely sonic examples in which different sound recording technologies, such as phonographic recording onto aluminum discs and an electromagnetic wire recorder, were used for ethno-musicological purposes, to record Serbian epic songs as a present-day analog of the Homeric epic. The point Ernst is making via these and other examples is that what the machines inscribe is less the songs than the materiality of the voice, now reconfigured as an electromagnetic flux of electrons which opened a different regime of signals operating as a substratum of cultural semiotics. 2011, 44-45. In fact, he suggests that the technological machine in fact listens much better than we do and is the better media archaeologist of culture, better than any human. 2011, 145, since it directly registers in electrophysical matter the material modulations of not only the voice, but all the present sonic signals without distinguishing between the important and the insignificant, meaning and noise, in line with human habits of filtering according to cognitive, cultural knowledge. 2011, 244. What might it mean to bring such a media archaeological gaze, or more specifically this listening to the non-cultural, non-narrative and the mechanic, into the realm of new media and its theorization? In the case of the Internet, this gaze would entail paying attention not only to the material substratum beneath or behind Internet content, such as its technological components, chips, modems, circuit boards, casings, wireless networks, etc., but also the technical, economic, social and environmental relations that both sustain the Internet and are generated by it. This might seem a leap from Ernst's formulations, which are vehemently against any resort to narrative, history, text or meaning, even as articulated within media archaeology itself, although paradox, presented by Ernst himself in the form of a number of technological fables. Nevertheless, the technological events that Ernst presents can only take place in the context of relations and economies, such as between the advent of new sound recording technologies and the developments of academic disciplines like ethnomusicology, not to mention a near obsession with the Greek origins of Western culture and media, as much apparent in media archaeology, as in the ethnomusicologists Ernst describes. The question of the relations surrounding any technical system is the point at which media archaeological concerns touch upon ecological ones, as in the thorny issues surrounding e-waste that media archaeologists like Perica have drawn attention to. For media archaeologists, the unevenly distributed phenomena of e-waste are not just a moral or environmental issue, but also are exactly the sort of site, as the rubbish dump of supposedly obsolescent, dead media, where media archaeology can be most fruitfully conducted. See Hertz and Perica 2010/2012. Not only does e-waste draw our attention to the toxic excesses of the teleological drive towards ever newer technologies, but also the ways in which media components go well beyond cleanly designed functional elements, to all sorts of non-biodegradable plastics, toxic chemicals and other substances, whose durations are as deserving of media archaeological attention as any more culturally defined Internet phenomena. Finally, for media archaeologists, obsolescent e-waste, far from being dead media, is more a case of the living dead or zombie media, as Hertz and Perica have proposed in their project for circuit-bending discarded electronic toys from the 80s into mutant musical instruments. Hertz and Perica, 2010/2012. Having situated media archaeology in relation to contemporary media research, this article will now plunge more directly into the field and examine some of its key theoretical currents, before returning to the question of its potential impact on studies of new media in general, and the Internet in particular. Archaeology of media archaeology. As with many earlier theoretical paradigms such as postmodernism or structuralism, media archaeology is traversed by debates, contestations and evasions, rendering any stable delimitation of the field at the very least difficult. Some of the key theorists held responsible for the media archaeology paradigm have either never or at least only in limited instances considered their work to be media archaeology, and both Friedrich Kibler and Siegfried Zielinski have gone as far as to question the usefulness of even the word media in their later work, the latter preferring the term variantology to describe his current research into techniques of hearing and seeing. 3. As for Kibler, his interests turned largely to cultural techniques in the classical world, for example, through conducting experiments to prove that Odysseus was lying when he claimed to have heard the siren song despite not coming ashore, as recounted in Homer's Odyssey. For despite these instabilities, this section will attempt to draw out some of the key concerns and insights of the field. From the perspective of media development, both media archaeology and ecology have their roots in the advent of new media, beginning with video and culminating in the current digital regime we now inhabit. Among the many effects of the appearance of successive new media technologies from the 70s onward was a significant challenge to the ways in which media had been conceptualized just at the very moment when critical film and media studies were becoming recognized as legitimate fields of academic research. While the histories of media research are varied and also took different forms according to both what media were being studied and in what context, a general tendency was to study media separately, that is to have departments and courses focused on film or cinema studies, television studies and less frequently radio, and this was reflected in publishing, which was medium specific and carved up the field in question in terms of concepts imported from literary studies or the social sciences into such fields as genre, authorship, industry, political economy, national cinema and media, and of course medium histories. See Assessor 2006, 13-15. While some contestation of this discipline formation of the field of media research was enacted by the transdisciplinary methodologies of cultural studies, this too tended to be confined to specific media forms, TV news, popular music, and not to call narrative histories and medium definitions into question. The figure most frequently evoked in the shift from medium history to media archaeology is of course Michel Foucault, whose project of the Archaeology of Knowledge, Foucault, 1989, is the primary inspiration for using this term in relation to media. However, The use of Foucauldian archaeology in media archaeology is by no means a homogeneous or uncritical one, and most media archaeologists insist on the need for the term to be reinvented or at least extended beyond the written archive that forms the basis for Foucault's studies of disciplinary sciences. While this might seem to resonate with Baudrillard's argument in Forget Foucault that Foucault's diagnoses of power appeared at just the moment when the forms of power they discerned were disappearing, Baudrillard, 1988. The media archaeological critique of Foucault is considerably more precise. The key limitation to Foucault's analysis, according to Friedrich Kittler, is that while based entirely on the written archive stored in libraries and other repositories, they do not acknowledge that writing is just one technical medium amongst others and one that had already lost many of its privileges at the time of Foucault's writing. Even writing itself, before it ends up in libraries, is a communication medium, the technology of which the archaeologist simply forgot. It is for this reason that all his analyses end immediately before that point in time at which other media penetrated the library's stacks. Discourse analysis cannot be applied to sound archives or towers of film rolls. Kittler 1999, 5. Nevertheless, however stating this criticism may seem, in many ways it is a dual call to open up questions of technicity to encompass writing, while at the same time opening up questions of the archive beyond written texts to encompass other forms of storage, transmission and retrieval. In this Kittler updates the dual innovations of Mcluhan's studies of the Gutenberg galaxy, Mcluhan 1962, and the latest forms of media communication, with the more rigorous insights of the Derridean deconstruction of the technicity of writing. Nevertheless, Foucauldian archaeology still remains an essential inspiration for any media archaeology since, despite these limitations, it provides a range of key principles for a nonlinear account of diverse media, their various crossings and contingent assemblages. As Elsesser puts it, what is most useful in Foucault's project is what he calls an archaeological agenda. Elsesser 2006, 17, encompassing an abandonment of the search for origins, a questioning of the already stated, and the description of discourses as practices, all of which can be found elucidated in Foucault's meta-archaeological text, The Archaeology of Knowledge. A media archaeological perspective then is necessarily a nonlinear one and one that disputes the already stated distribution of winners and losers in teleological medium narratives, whether this be an inventor, a technical invention or a whole media dispositive or assemblage. This tendency can be seen clearly in both Zielinski's Archaeology of Cinema and Television as contingent assemblages of seeing and hearing in his book Audio Visions, 1999, as well as in Kittler's Gramophone, Film, Typewriter, 1999. In these studies, the contingency of media assemblages are emphasized as are their crossings, not only with each other but also other modern technical phenomena like warfare and psychology, to name only two. While the shift to a media archaeological perspective often emphasizes content in line with the famous Mcluhan formula of the medium being the message, this is not necessarily a shift to a hard technological determinism. Certainly it can seem to take this form in Kittler's work. After all, the very first line of the preface to his key media archaeological text famously reads, "Media determine our situation, which despite or because of it deserves a description." 1999, 6. Nevertheless, this hard statement of media determinism, while not merely rhetorical, proves to be less severe in Kittler's actual analyses of media, in which creators and experimenters certainly play a key role, and media assemblages are repeatedly shown not to be implemented when this would have been first technically possible, but only when the right socio-technical assemblage is able to make use of them. Media archaeology versus anorchaeology. In a less deterministic vein, Zielinski privileges the artist-inventors of the technologies of seeing and hearing that he investigates, whether of the more conventional media such as cinema and television, or the deeper historical studies he presents in Deep Time of the Media, which extend media archaeology back to the Renaissance and even to the classical world, since techniques of seeing and hearing have a much longer history than that of contemporary mass entertainment media. This is yet another effect of an archaeological approach, to extend the temporal layers of media back beyond their usually circumscribed periodization as artifacts of recent modernity. Furthermore, Zielinski is as if not more interested in imaginary media that never existed except as dreams, diagrams and imaginative schemes, as he is in actually realized and implemented media forms, showing the proximity between this style of media archaeology and the field of imaginary media. See Kludenberg, editor, 2006. While this article does not intend to follow Zielinski into these realms of pre-19th century technical invention and imaginaries in such domains as alchemy and combinatorial systems, it does point to a key insight of media archaeology that necessarily extends the concept of media beyond narrow definitions of mass media. This applies as much to other modes of communication as it does to the deep time that Zielinski is excavating. Another key insight of Zielinski's relating directly to the field of media archaeology, is that Foucault's Archaeology of Knowledge project would be better characterized as an archaeology. This idea, that Zielinski adapts from the German Foucault scholar Rudi Visker, is that while archaeology in the conventional, disciplinary sense implies an ordering and governing of the ancient or original, archios plus logos, Foucauldian archaeology evades any idea of a standardized object, of an original experience. Visker cited in Zielinski 2006, 27. What this means for a truly Foucauldian media archaeology is the idea of a history that entails envisioning, listening, and the art of combining using technical devices, which privileges a sense of their multifarious possibilities over their realities in the form of products. Zielinski 2006, 27. Essentially what Zielinski takes from this idea of an archaeology, leaving aside the question of to what extent this is still Foucault's method in relation to the archive or his own, is a nonlinear history, one that is as, if not more, interested in the losers, or inventors and inventions that remain potential and imaginary rather than actual and implemented, and that rejects any idea of either origin or teleology. For this reason, Zielinski is as interested in examples such as Athanasius Kircher's allegorical drawings and magic lanterns as he is in the latest examples of digital art, with considerably more focus on the former than the latter. While Zielinski's plea to keep the concept of media as wide open as possible, 2006, 33, is an important one. The direction in which he responds to this plea, namely via the investigation of a range of media archaeological curiosities, is not the only road that can be taken in the elaboration of a media and archaeology. It is one thing to call linear temporalities into question, and quite another to abandon interest in temporal shifts altogether in a kind of deep time that risks becoming only a series of eternal moments of invention which, as Zielinski himself puts it, blur together heterogeneous times and spaces. I developed an awareness of different time periods that we often experience with regards to places, for example, to discover Krakow and Palermo, to come across Rome and New York. Phases, moments, or periods that sported particular data as labels began to overlap in their meanings and valences. Wasn't Petrograd's techno scene in the 1910 seconds and 1920 seconds more relevant and faster than that of London, Detroit or Cologne at the turn of the last century? Zielinski 2006, 11. Despite Zielinski's reference to his archaeological examples as dynamic moments in the media archaeological record that enter into a relationship of tension with various present-day moments, 2006, 11, or attractive foci where possible directions for development were tried out and paradigm shifts took place, 2006, 31. In practice they often seem plucked out of the economic, social and technological modes of development they were embedded in and given a semi-eternal status as the great inventions of great men with an undisguised and critical act of constructing media archaeological heroes, 2006, 34. But is a new canon of great media inventors and dreamers any better than a pantheon of great cinematic authors? It certainly does not seem very anarchic, but rather a strangely revised reinvention of a great if relatively occult tradition that sacrifices at least one key aim of Foucauldian archaeology, namely a non-teleological way of accounting for historical change. While it may be accepted that Foucauldian archaeology disrupts the linear order of historical causation and succession, this is not a relativist denial of relations between the present and the past but rather an insistence on their force and power. In particular, if Foucauldian archaeology insists upon heterogeneity, this is in order to get at real processes of change, or as Foucault puts it in the Archaeology of Knowledge, to establish the system of transformations that constitutes change. Foucault 1989, 173. This is what some commentators on Foucault have referred to as the history of the present, or the rules governing what it is possible to express in a given spatio-temporal episteme, but more broadly than that it refers to something like a Deleuze and Guattarian concept of becomings, of real change that a given state of affairs certainly modulates and conditions but which, nevertheless, has the capacity and tendency to escape this given state. See Deleuze and Guattari 1980, 256-341. In this light, archaeology, the history of the present, or becomings, are not outside of history, as great moments of invention but rather refer to the perpetual flux of real temporal change out of which historical narratives emerge in a process of capture, always in favor of particular ends and power formations. Much as it is tempting to follow Zielinski in his media and archaeological, deep time machine, exploring the wonders that the conventional and non-conventional archive have to offer and their capacities to transport us from one spatio-temporal variant to another, it is also important to maintain the foothold in processes of real change, whose aesthetic and importantly political effects are felt all too keenly in the present. 5 Strangely, Zielinski's earlier work Audio Visions, in its explorations of the materiality of the media within the triadic relationship of culture-subject media, seen as reciprocally defining terms. Zielinski 1999, 20. Comes closer to giving a nonlinear history of media invention, expanding closed accounts of the histories of both cinema and television into a broader field of material media practices and inventions. Nevertheless, despite these intentions, there is still an almost exclusive focus on technical inventions and inventors rather than the socio-technical assemblages into which these technologies have been implanted. The insistence on the importance of engaging with real processes of change and providing a history of the present is at any rate a justification for the type of media and archaeology that will be explored here. This raises another issue connected with Germanic media archaeology, namely its privileging of science and scientific invention over social and political processes. While this is often done out of a valuable rejection of humanist tendencies and overemphasis on such frozen social categories as the audience or media institutions, the result is often the jettisoning of the socio-political altogether, or at least its relegation to an epiphenomenon. More than this, the narrow equation of invention with science and technology, even if this is moderated by an interest in other actors including in Hitler's case not only film directors but quite surprisingly also pop musicians like Pink Floyd or Jimi Hendrix, tends to exclude any consideration of how media function as vectors of political invention. It is as if any consideration of the explicitly or obviously political is too tarred with the brush of cultural studies populism and its resistant audiences or embodied spectators to warrant serious consideration, unless it is to echo Virilio's conclusions about media as the misuse of military equipment. See Virilio 1989, also a favor trope of Kibler, see Kibler 1999, 110.6. Of course the very focus on the material when anticipated around the 2000 millennium bug. The joke, of course, being that, as the nerds know and everyone else should know, the internet is an immaterial, distributed network and it is absurd to locate it within any black box. Jen and the shareholders are just demonstrating their own ignorance when they do so. Nevertheless, media archaeologists would not necessarily see it in this way and might rather be with Jen, in their interests in any number of black boxes making up the material strata or substrata of the internet, rather than seeing it as an immaterial and virtually disembodied phenomenon. A media archaeological perspective, therefore, would want to literally get inside the black box, to break it open and examine its physical workings, in a perspective more informed by physics and engineering than cultural hermeneutics or semantics. At the limit this would mean the exclusion of any interest not only in internet content or user practices, considered as so much ephemeral awash, but even in software itself that Kibler famously declared not to exist, at least when one drills down to its engineering basis. Not only no program, but no underlying microprocessor system could ever start without the rather incredible autobooting faculty of some elementary functions that, for safety's sake, are burned into silicon and thus form part of the hardware. All code operations, despite their metaphoric faculties such as call or return, come down to absolutely local string manipulations and that is, I am afraid, to signifiers of voltage differences. Kibler, 1995, MP. Winthrop Young has shown how this approach connects up with the politics of open source movements, in its rejection of the delusions generated by the user-friendly interfaces of proprietorial software systems that in reality are less transparent windows than one-way mirrors. Winthrop Young 2011, 76. Screening out the real operations of machines from any human gaze. Winthrop Young has analyzed Kibler's insistence on programming, preferably using basic programming and operating languages, as an uncharacteristically Enlightenment, even activist moment in his work, the demand to at least rise above our software-supported immaturity and interact eye-to-eye, or signal-to-signal, with all that is on the verge of leaving us behind. 2011, 77. In this optic then, media archaeological approaches to the internet would be limited to hardware studies of the matter, materials, physical infrastructures and operating systems that sudden digital networks, and indeed some media archaeologists have followed this route in recent work. However, in that the levels of software, programs and protocols are materially anchored to hardware materials via operating systems, they are in a sense equally material and certainly just as real, hence the proximity between media archaeological approaches and approaches like software studies as Peric and others have indicated, 2012a, 86-88. Therefore media materialist theoretical projects ranging from that of Galloway on protocols, 2006, to that of Fuller on media ecologies, 2007, and especially his more recent work in software studies can be seen as bringing a media archaeological approach to bear on the level of software as well as hardware, while still maintaining a focus on material processes, rather than on interpretations of media content. While not specifically named as media archaeology, similar approaches have also proven highly fertile for thinking of the internet in a nonlinear temporal perspective, rather than as an eternal and teleological perpetually renewed present. Examples in this respect are projects like Ulia Iolina's research of what she calls the vernacular web, of the 90s. According to Iolina, this vernacular web was bright, rich, personal, slow and under construction. It was a web of sudden connections and personal links. Pages were built on the edge of tomorrow, full of hope for a faster connection and a more powerful computer. One could say it was the web of the indigenous. Or the barbarians, Iolina 2005. Whether looking at such things as the design and profusion of 1992's Jessides sites or the fateful decline of urban internet cafes in Rotterdam, Iolina's perspective is one that, while not explicitly presented as media archaeology, follows highly media archaeological principles, focusing on material practices within a non-linear sense of history that, as with revisionist film history, refuses to consign the recent past to the dustbin of history as a primitive phenomenon only of curiosity value. Instead, Iolina's project indicates the ongoing, retromaniac, nature of internet development that constitutes a highly media archaeological perspective. Just as clothing styles come back into fashion, so do web designs. On a visual level, things reappear. Last year I noticed that progressive web designers returned to an eclectic style, reincorporating wallpapers and 3D lettering in their work. In the near future, frames and construction signs will show up as retro, and the beautiful old elements will be stripped of their meaning and contexts. Iolina 2005. Such an approach to the vernacular web also suggests a tendency of media archaeology picked up on in Vivian Sobchak's somewhat oblique account of the field as, following Hayden White, a form of meta-history. More specifically, Sobchak claims that the media archaeological project should be seen as meta-history in a decidedly romantic mode, owing to its almost fetishistic interest in the presence, in Hutama and Parika 2011, 328, of otherwise neglected objects, machines and technological processes, and insistence on an approach to the things themselves rather than their cultural mediations, representations and interpretations. Media archaeology ideologically, and in terms of its literal alliances and differences from the disciplines of history, film and media studies, and cultural studies, retains its anarchic status as undisciplined left square bracket and right square bracket poses a major challenge to these disciplines' epistemic norms and established values. 2011. 330. While such a characterization in terms of romanticism would perhaps be justified in relation to some aspects of Ziolinski's project, with its unabashed desire to celebrate great inventions and inventors unjustly neglected in teleological media history, in a spirit of praise and commendation, not of critique. Ziolinski, 2006. 34. The more materialist orientations such as those of Ernst, Kibler and more recently Parika, escape this romantic orientation via the insistence on rigorous attention to matter and machines, one that in its most recent articulations takes on distinctly ecological characteristics, beyond the human-machine interface. A new chemical, geological turn in media archaeology? Rather than point to more examples of internet-focused media archaeological projects, I would like to point to some speculations of media archaeologist Jussi Parika on the future of media theory as bin theory, 2012. These comments are interesting as a contrast to a recent text by Geert Lovink, Media Studies, Diagnostics of a Failed Merger, Lovink, 2012, 76-94, which suggests that the very paradigm and discipline of media studies ought to be abandoned as a failed merger, in favor of a separation into different spheres, so that studies of network digital media would have nothing to do with the discipline of media studies out of which it emerged and in which it is often but not always located in a disciplinary sense. Media studies is presently an abandoned construction site, crumbling under its own neglect. Do we willfully continue a failed project? Or should we acknowledge its growing cracks and celebrate its successes as we raise it to the ground and start anew? Loving 2012, 77. Such a tabula rasa approach both underestimates the potential contributions of a media archaeological approach and itself subscribes to the logic of inbuilt obsolescence that structures the development of new technological commodities, that media archaeology in all its variations consistently rejects. Parika's bin theory would approach this situation rather differently, not interesting itself so much in these turf wars but the turf itself and what lies below it. We can use theory as a pathway itself to open up and question lists of things, as well as old habits, and include a range of new things for our conceptualizations. There is a practice of theory as well. Left square bracket T right square bracket things ecological, even under another theoretical theme of past years, media ecology, are mapped as part of the very concrete material contexts in which media takes place and displaces. Rubbish, electronic waste, and the concrete ecological contexts of media are what constitute another way of seeing where things come from and end up. Parika, 2012b, MP. In a more recent text, Parika has taken these insights further in a stratigraphic direction, emphasizing the cycle of chemicals and geological materials essential to internet and computer technologies in their passage from underground mining to post-industrial waste. Arguing for an alternative, and literal, deep time of the media, Perica departs from the romantic traces of the media archaeological project that Sobchak identified, in favor of a rigorous engagement with the non-human ecologies that are intimately bound up with media technologies and their archaeology. Left square bracket, right square bracket, more geologically tuned deep time, deep in various senses, down to mineral excavation, and picking up some themes of a media ecological sort. A media excavation into the mineral and raw material basis of technological development, through which to present some media historical arguments as to how one might adopt a material perspective in terms of ecological temporality. Perica 2012 c. Such a perspective may seem quite far from the usual concerns of media research, whether of a relatively theoretical or empirical persuasion, and even from the description of the field of media archaeology given earlier in this article. Nevertheless, it is in the radical openness of media archaeological approaches and methods to the material constitution of media and their associated technologies that media archaeology has the most to offer contemporary media research, at the very point that its cartographic excavations touch on questions of a media ecological nature, beyond merely human durations. These media ecological inflections of media archaeology need not only go in the non-human geological/chemical direction sketched out by Perica, but can also extend studies of media systems into other ecological contexts, such as their deployment in urban environments, their potentials for technological misuse, breakage and noise, and lastly their collective deployment as political socio-technical assemblages, as I have previously discussed in relation to Italian and contemporary pirate radio. Goddard, 2011. Such approaches, if they are to remain media archaeological, will need to pay strict attention to the material elements and relations of any media system, but do not necessarily need to exclude the political effects of such material systems on the social contexts in which they are embedded. However, they point to articulations of new media with the social that cannot rely on ossified terminologies of producers, audiences, users, technologies, meanings and representations, but rather non-representational archaeological and ecological terms that willfully articulate their dynamic and material relations and processes.